What is a Nation? In his most famous essay, What is a Nation?, French historian Ernest Renan warns the reader, quote, "It is a delicate thing that I propose to do here, somewhat akin to vivisection. I'm going to treat the living much as one ordinarily treats the dead. I shall adopt an absolutely cool and impartial attitude," unquote. This is, in part, what anthropological analysis often does, takes a step back from the lived reality of the familiar in order to understand it anew. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about nations and nationhood from this kind of abstract position. And to do it, I'm going to use two main sources. One of them is Renan's essay, What is the Nation?, written in French in 1882. And the other is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, which you read as part of preparation for this class. And what's interesting about these two people is that they come at nationhood from two very different standpoints, right? So Ernest Renan is a French liberal writing in the late 1800s who's very much embracing the necessity and value of nations and nationalism, and in particular of his own French nation and French nationalism, and trying to give it a theoretical basis. So ripping apart, vivisecting, right, that is dissecting while alive, his own sense of feelings and what's necessary for them, and making a case for them. And Benedict Anderson is a late 20th century political scientist and to some extent anthropologist who is analyzing how did nations and nationhood come about over the long run in imagined communities. And he's coming from a position where he's a Southeast Asian specialist, and his key area of fieldwork had been looking at various details of primarily leftist movements in Southeast Asia, the largest of which were focused around Indochina, right, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And after they're surviving the war with the United States, that the U.S. remembers as the Vietnam War, these countries are going to descend into some international hostility, right? So they very much had raised the banner of a kind of transnational leftism, and yet left and in a titanic military struggle, and yet nationalism became a really significant part of their own self-understanding. So a thing that Benedict Anderson is doing in Imagined Communities is kind of grappling with that process. However, he managed to do so in a way that is more sympathetic and engaged with the possibilities and merits of nationalism than many other leftist writers about nationalism in the late 20th century. Like I said, two very different perspectives, but we'll see the many, many places where they overlap, which is probably a good sort of stereo vision of how to think about what a nation actually is. So Renan, writing about a nation, puts forward this description. A nation is therefore a great solidarity constituted by the feeling of sacrifices made and those that one is still disposed to make. It presupposes a past, but it is reiterated in the present by a tangible fact, consent, the clearly expressed desire to continue a common life. A nation's existence is, please excuse the metaphor, a daily plebiscite, just as an individual's existence is a perpetual affirmation of life. So this sets up a kind of highly democratic, right, centered on a plebiscite or a referendum, a yes or no vote that people engage in, that is connected to the individual, right, that is about individual membership and is rooted in deep feeling and as a great solidarity. And in many ways, this prefigures the definition that Anderson is going to put forward in the 1980s of the nation as an imagined political community. And by him, what he means by imagined is in part that this community is something that exists in the head, right? It's something that people conceptualize without it being there. And as he writes, it's imagined because the members of the nation, quote, will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. And yet it's a community because, as he goes on to write, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. So this is a pretty powerful example of a cultural construct, something that exists in the mind, yet is also deeply felt emotionally, and that has practical and political consequences. And he refers to this relationship amongst members of the community as deep horizontal comradeship. In other words, a sense of being in the nation together without necessarily being in rank one over the other. And in fact, the nation as a kind of space in which people meet on equal terms. And significantly, right, to both his research project and to his imagination or description of the imagined community, is the willingness of people to give their lives for this imaginary formation, right? To sacrifice themselves in wartime, or to make large-scale sacrifices in order to preserve the larger nation. And on the other hand, to think of this community as being both limited and sovereign. So let me explain what he means by that. So it's limited because a nation is a finite space. It has finite, if elastic, boundaries beyond which lie other nations, right? So nations are one of a set. No nation imagined itself coterminous with mankind. And so this is different than dynastic aspirations that went before it, and it's different than some ideological aspirations to changing or rallying or freeing all of humankind, or some kind of class formation that will come in some places after it. A nation is one of many, and it has a kind of modular structure. So you can have a national passport, like this one from Switzerland, in which it designates your place in a system of other nations. However, this idea of sovereign is to say a nation ought to rule itself. Or, as Anderson writes, nations dream of being free, and if under God, directly so, right? Not indirectly. The gauge and emblem of this freedom is a sovereign state. So we think of nations in their ideal form as yearning for and achieving a political state. Also, at the same time, nations are conceptualized as these long-running conceptual formations that reach back into the past, that loom out of either medium-term or long-term memories, right? So these are two, this is a monument on the left from Guyana, formerly a colony, that looks back to the 1763 slave uprising, the Bourbis uprising, as a moment at which its own independence as a majority Afro-descendant community was foreshadowed, even though that was long before Guyana's independence. And on the right side, you see the nation of Cambodia and its postage stamp remembering Angkor Wat, this immense archaeological site that was formerly the capital of its own polity, not necessarily Cambodia itself. So Renan writes that forgetting is in fact central to the making of nations. That forgetting, he writes, I would even go so far to say as historical error is a crucial factor in the creation of a nation, which is why progress in historical studies often constitutes a danger for nationality. And so if you look at this image here, this is on in the inside of, or hangs on the inside of the United States Capitol Rotunda. It is an image called Discovery of the Mississippi, and it depicts Spanish explorer De Soto, who led a team of around 600 men to basically go on a careening journey across what's now the southeast of the United States in the 1500s. And he's remembered as the first European to arrive at the Mississippi, thereby discovering it in a way that the Native American folks that you see depicted here somehow hadn't done ever. Renan goes on to write, indeed, historical inquiry brings to light deeds of violence which took place at the origin of all political formations. And that is definitely the case here. Even though De Soto was not establishing a durable political dominion, but kind of just on a like wild reconnoitering ride that took him for 5 years across the American Southeast. He nevertheless managed to go to war with a series of his hosts, including those who appeared just in his journey, just before he got to the Mississippi River, the town of Mobile in what's present day Alabama or Mississippi, which he burned down in one of the largest and most deadly confrontations of pre 1700 Euro Native American warfare. The town of Mobile, which he burned down in one of the largest battles between Europeans and Native Americans prior to 1700 in what is now the United States. Taking this strange combination of remembering and forgetting as a given, Renan goes on to write, "These are the essential conditions of being a people, having common glories in the past and a will to continue them in the present, having made great things together and wishing to make them again. One loves in proportion to the sacrifices that one has committed and the troubles that one has suffered." Suffered together, I said, for shared suffering unites more than does joy. In fact, periods of mourning are worth more to national memory than triumphs because they impose duties and require a common effort. So let's talk in particular about the common effort of military sacrifice, right? The nation appears as this figure who's capable of leading people into battle and for which people are willing to die. What you're seeing depicted here is a French depiction of liberty eventually, and this is Eugene Delacroix's painting, Liberty Guiding the People. The image of a woman leading the French people either into battle for the country or revolution, as in this painting, eventually became the signature image of French nationalism. She's known as Mary Anne, the female personification of France and of liberty, and is now actually recognized as part of the national government logo of the French Republic. In important ways, the modern democratic nation state is founded on the willingness of people to identify themselves with the national interests and purpose of their nation. And in some ways, this is an aspect of nationhood that comes out of the age of revolution. So as Barbara Ehrenreich writes here in this phenomenally titled essay, Guns and the Democratization of Glory, the French Revolution had this profound effect on military recruitment and military participation. Before the revolution, she writes, no effort had been made to encourage the soldiers to identify with the aims of the war. It was assumed that they had no interest in them. So in effect, that war was basically about disciplining a set of people, a set of conscripts into fighting. After the revolution, however, the soldier no longer fought merely on behalf of a king, but for an ideal which encompassed the whole nation under the symbols of the tricolor and the anthem, the Marseillaise. A key point in Anderson's book is the way that this complex of ideas associated with the nation became kind of a global template. As he writes, the independence movements in the Americas, which he identifies as the first place where nationalist movements and then new nations came into being, became concepts, models, and indeed blueprints as soon as they were printed about. Out of the American welter came these imagined realities: nation states, republican institutions, common citizenships, popular sovereignty, national flags and anthems, etc. And this became a template that went all around the world. I'm going to just show you some visually striking examples from when nationalism structured Slavic political life. So you may or may not be familiar with this Art Nouveau artist named Alphonse Mucha, whose signature style is in the upper left in an early Czech bit of currency. He is also the creator of a set of paintings called the Slav Epic, and these are massive, floor-to-ceiling, 10-foot-high murals depicting the long history of Slavic peoples. It's very much a story, right, initially of ancient religious connections, right, looming out of an immemorial past, but also long periods of suffering, in which you see the Slavs who are represented here as these like small dispossessed family of refugees as armies clash over them during a long period of time in which the German and Russian empires basically effaced much of Slavic sovereignty. And Anderson goes on to highlight how nations were associated with various forms of liberation from oppression. So the liquidation of their conceptual opposites, whether dynastic empires, monarchical institutions, absolutisms, subjecthoods, inherited nobilities, serfdoms, ghettos, and so forth. So a nation can take on and embody a product of class uplift, of social uplift, of decolonization, and so on. So in another frieze in the Slav epic, we see the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861, right, still actually under a dynastic ruler, as a foreshadowing of the liberation of Slavic peoples. So there are many facets of nationalism, but it has become a globally hegemonic way of organizing political life, represented no better than the global and transnational institution of the United Nations, which brings together over 200 polities and is the basic foundation of global political order. Indeed, global and international mean almost the same thing.